What's up, fam? Welcome back to another chilling chapter. Before we dive into today's twisted mystery Nero Wolfe and the silence of the Black Typewriter, hit me up. What made you smile today? And where in the world are you listening from? I'm featuring your stories in the next drop, so don't be shy. Now grab your tea, dim the lights, and get ready. Because nothing in Whispers in the Fog is ever what it seems. Chapter 1. The client who wouldn't sit down when the buzzer rang at precisely 10 minutes past 11. I was halfway through a perfectly toasted English muffin and not inclined to move. But since Nero Wolfe had already lifted his eyes from the morning paper with that glacial annoyance of his, I wiped the butter from my fingers, stood, and went to the front door of the brownstone. She was the kind of woman who made doormen forget. Their jobs and elevator boys skip floors. Tall, polished, and radiating that Fifth Avenue lacquer that says, "I've never been told no." Her coat was cashmere, the shoes Italian, and the look in her eyes said she was used to people making space. Or else. "I need Nero Wolfe," she said, without so much as a good morning. I gave her my best smile. A lot of people do. The key difference is whether he needs you. Archie Goodwin, assistant and on rare occasions, miracle worker. Come in. She stepped inside like she owned the marble under her heels and the air around her. I closed the door and guided her to the office. Wolfe was seated behind his desk, flanked by stacks of old books like they were bodyguards. His bulk hadn't shifted more than half an inch since I left, but his gaze was on her, direct, appraising, and not the least bit welcoming. "I take it you are not here to sell encyclopedias," he said without rising. "No," she replied. "I'm here to ask you to investigate a death." That got his attention. Not enough to make him stand, of course, but enough to make him fold the Times with a sigh and set it on the desk. "Your name?" he asked. "Margot Sweeney. You may have heard of me." "I make it a point not to," Wolfe replied. "Archie, magazine editor," I supplied. "Formerly of Vantage. Took it from sensationalist pulp to respectable ink. Then jumped ship. A year ago." "Precisely," she said, sitting down, uninvited, on the edge of the red chair closest to Wolfe's desk. "And my friend is dead." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Which friend, and why is that unusual?" Thomas Lane was a writer. He used to pound away on a black Royal typewriter like it owed him money. We found him slumped over it in his apartment last night. The police think it was a heart attack. "And you think otherwise?" Wolfe said. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "But I saw it. I know otherwise," she said. "Tom was scared before he died. He told me someone was watching him." Wolfe pressed his fingertips together and shut his eyes. His classic signal for either deep contemplation or extreme irritation. "And why, Miss Sweeney?" he asked, voice like velvet with razor wire beneath it. "Should I care if a writer, burdened by neurosis and deadlines, dies of fright over imagined shadows?" "Because he left a story behind," she said quietly, opening her purse. "Typed, but incomplete, and the last page is missing." That made Wolfe's eyes flick open. I leaned forward. "A missing manuscript page?" "A very specific one. Tom was working on an exposé. On someone powerful." "Names?" I asked. She shook her head. "He didn't tell me, but he said if anything happened to him, to bring the pages to someone smart enough to see what was there." "Flattery," Wolfe said, "is a fine perfume. but unless it conceals a fee, it's wasted in this room." She reached into her coat and pulled out a checkbook. 5,000, retainer. Wolfe didn't even glance at the figure. "Archie, take Miss Sweeney's coat, then cancel our appointments for the next 2 days." "Of course," I said, "though you didn't have any." He ignored me. "And tell Fritz to keep the lunch warm. We shall be busy." "Do you think Tom was murdered?" she asked. "No," Wolfe replied. "I think he was silenced." And just like that, the game was on. Chapter 2. A page. Torn from the truth by the time I had Miss Sweeney's coat hung in the front closet, and Fritz informed that the meatloaf would be delayed, Wolfe was already thumbing through the typed pages she'd handed over like they were a second-rate menu. He didn't read fast. He absorbed. You could practically hear the paper shrinking from the scrutiny. Miss Sweeney had taken the red chair again, legs crossed like she was still in an editorial boardroom. "He always typed on that old Black Royal," she repeated, as if we hadn't grasped the detail the first time. It was loud. He used to say the clacking helped him think. Wolfe grunted. "This isn't prose. It's a cipher wearing a trench coat." He lifted a sheet between 2 fingers. He wasn't writing for an audience. He was writing to provoke. I slid into the chair beside her, notebook in hand, pencil ready. All right, let's cut through the fog. Who exactly would Tom Lane want to provoke? She turned, her voice clipped. He never told me. I was his editor, not his mother. You said he was afraid. He was. Paranoid even. Said someone had been in his apartment while he was out. Thought he was being followed. I told him to go to the police, but he refused. And now he's dead, I said. Convenient, isn't it? Wolfe made a noise that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Was he working from home? I asked. She nodded. Always. His apartment is on West 78th. Top floor walk-up. Cluttered. Smelled like coffee and ink. I jotted it down. Who found? Him? The super. Said he was delivering a package and saw the door ajar. Walked in and found Tom face down on the typewriter. No sign of forced entry. None. Police said heart attack. Natural causes. But that's because the coroner was in and out like he had matinee tickets. Wolfe folded his hands over his stomach, which was a sure sign his brain was chewing on something. And this missing page, it was the final one? She nodded. He usually numbered them by hand in the upper right. This batch goes up to 23. No 24. And no carbon copy, I asked. He didn't believe in them. One draft only. Live dangerous. Write once, he used to say. Quaint, Wolfe murmured. I stood. I'll head over to West 78th. Take a look around. Maybe chat with the super. Wolfe waved a hand. Do, and bring back details. Spare me no smell, stain, or scuff mark. Meanwhile, I shall see what can be gleaned from his words. And sure, Sweeney rose with me, adjusting her gloves. I want to know who did this, Mr. Wolfe, and why. You may yet, Wolfe said, but whether you like the answer is not within my jurisdiction. I escorted her out, giving her a nod at the door. You'll hear from us. She gave me a look like she was used to hearing from people, just not ones she had to wait on. Once she disappeared into the cab, I turned back inside, grabbed my coat and notebook, and made for the door. Wolfe called after me. Archie! Yeah, do not get arrested. Wouldn't dream of it, I said, and stepped out into the here. Crisp grey Manhattan afternoon that smelled faintly of newsprint and the distant echo of typewriter keys. Next stop, the scene of the silent crime. Chapter 3. A door left unlocked. The building on West 78th was the kind of place that had once been elegant, before time and tenants stripped it down to bare utility. The banister was chipped, the tile cracked in a few artistic places, and the front door groaned like it resented being used. I made my way up 5 flights, past a pair of arguing newlyweds, a dozing basset hound, and wallpaper that hadn't seen a fresh coat since Roosevelt was in office. The first one. Thomas Lane's apartment door was shut but not locked, and the super story about finding it ajar came back to me with a little more weight. The air inside was stale, coffee grounds had crusted in the sink, and someone had knocked over a potted plant in the corner, either in a hurry or with a vendetta against ficuses. The typewriter sat on a desk near the window, exactly where you'd expect it. But there was a quiet drama to the scene. The chair was slightly askew. A mug of cold coffee stood like a fossilized monument beside the typewriter, and there, like a punctuation mark on the whole setup, was the ribbon. Still threaded, still taut, as if expecting one more page. The place hadn't been ransacked. If someone had searched it, they'd done it like a librarian. Careful, quiet and with gloves. I gave the desk a once-over. The top drawer held nothing but paperclips, a cracked ruler, and an unopened pack of Camel cigarettes. The bottom drawer had a small collection of notepads, one of which bore a scribbled name, in blue ink, Calton, 11 p.m. I tore that sheet off and slipped it into my pocket. Next, I made a round of the room. Bookshelves stacked with pulp novels, a couch that had lost its stuffing war years ago, and a framed black-and-white photo on the end table. It showed Lane, in better days, standing beside a younger woman in a peacoat, both of them laughing. No inscription, no clue, but a good face to remember. I was about to check the bedroom when someone knocked on the open door behind me. "Hey, you're not supposed to be in there." The voice belonged to a man in his 60s, balding but built, like he could still break up a bar fight. His janitor's keys jingled as he stepped into view. "Super?" I asked. "That's right." "Stan. And you are?" "Archie Goodwin. I work with Nero Wolfe. We're looking into Mr. Lane's death." He frowned. "Police said it was natural." "Sure. But nature doesn't usually walk out with a missing manuscript page." That made him blink. "I didn't take anything. I just found him like that. Door was wide open." "You sure it wasn't forced?" He shook his head. "No marks. I even checked. Tom had a habit of leaving it unlocked if he stepped out for smokes. I told him he'd get robbed someday. Anyone else come by recently?" Besides the cop and the coroner, some guy in a grey coat, tall, thin, looked like a lawyer or an undertaker. Came by a day before Tom kicked it. Said he was delivering a legal document. Did Lane say anything after he left? Just looked spooked. He slammed the door and didn't come out for hours. I jotted it down. "You know the woman in the photo on his table?" Stan nodded. "That's his sister. Claire, I think. Used to visit once in a blue moon. Haven't seen her in a year. Though, do you have a forwarding address?" "Nope." Tom didn't talk much about family. Liked to keep his ghosts in the closet. I left Stan with a handshake and a suggestion not to tidy up until Wolfe said otherwise. Then I walked 2 blocks down to a diner called Patsy's, grabbed a corner booth and a cup of overcooked coffee, and reviewed my notes. A scribbled name. A missing page. a nervous writer, and a visitor in grey. And something told me that black Royal Typewriter still had a few secrets left in it. I paid the bill, lit a cigarette, and headed back to the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting, and so was whatever was on page 24. Chapter 4. Wolfe raises an eyebrow. When I returned to the brownstone, the smell of garlic and thyme hit me first. Fritz was already elbow-deep in preparations for a late lunch. Wolfe would pretend not to be excited about until the moment it was placed in front of him. I let myself in, hung my coat, and found Wolfe where I'd left him, planted in his chair like a monarch with gout, eyes half closed and fingers steepled over his middle. He didn't look up when I walked in. "You've been gone 1 hour and 39 minutes, he said. "Either the building collapsed or you found something." "Maybe both." I dropped into the red chair and handed over the sheet with the scribbled note. "Found that in the desk drawer. Calton, 11 p.m. Ring a bell." Wolfe took the paper, turned it over once as if inspecting it for scent, then set it on his blotter. "The writing is hasty, hesitant, as if he was debating whether to remember the name or forget it." "That's poetic," I said. "Want the practical version?" "Spare me the sarcasm, Archie." I launched into a summary of the apartment, the missing page, the typewriter, and the mysterious visitor in grey. Wolfe didn't interrupt, but I could see his eyes tightening slightly at certain points. The mention of the open door, the sister, the super's name. When I finished, he opened a drawer and removed a small index card. "Do you recall a man named Oliver Calton?" I frowned. "Not off the top of my head." "Publisher, owns a boutique press uptown, Calton House. They specialize in exposés, scandal memoirs, and questionable ethics." "Sounds like a perfect match for Tom Lane." "Indeed, and Calton is known for discretion. It would be fitting, would it not, for a journalist trying to slip a dangerous manuscript into publication to reach out to him?" I nodded. "If he did, that might explain the man in grey. But why would Calton or anyone kill him over a manuscript that hadn't even gone to press?" Wolfe exhaled. "Because perhaps it did, or it nearly did, and the wrong person read the right words." He leaned forward, which for Wolfe was equivalent to a gymnast's somersault, and tapped the sheaf of manuscript pages still stacked on his desk. "This is not a story," he said. "It's a minefield. Names are thinly veiled, events only slightly fictionalized. If one had motive and means, it would not be hard to trace themselves in the shadows here." "Got a suspect in mind?" "Several," Wolfe replied, "but I intend to refine the list. You, Archie, will visit Mr. Calton. Do not tell him we are investigating. Present yourself as a curious party interested in the late Mr. Lane's work." "You want me to flirt with the truth," I said. "I want you to court it," Wolfe corrected, "and see if it blushes." Before I could respond with something snappy, Fritz entered, silent as snowfall. "Lunch is served, sir." Wolfe practically levitated. As he rose and lumbered out of the room, I called after him. "Anything I should know before I charm Calton into confession?" "Yes," Wolfe said without turning. "Do not eat anything he offers you." By 3 o'clock, I was back in motion, fed and ready to probe a publisher who played with fire for a living. Wolfe had thrown down the chessboard. Now it was my move. and I had a feeling Calton was holding back more than just rejected manuscripts. Chapter 5. The man behind the Cover Calton house was the sort of place that tried very hard not to look like a publishing firm. It occupied 2 floors of a converted townhouse on East 62nd, with tasteful green shutters, a polished brass nameplate, and an entryway that smelled like pipe smoke and silent disapproval. Inside, it was all wood panelling and rugs that muffled your conscience. The receptionist looked like she was paid in cigarettes and secrets. She gave me a raised eyebrow when I introduced myself as a literary scout, which I thought sounded less suspicious than nosy detective with good shoes. She led me upstairs without asking questions. Either she was used to strange visitors, or Calton had no open-door policy, because all the doors were already open. Oliver Calton was tall and thin, with a face carved from ivory and an expression that suggested someone had just insulted his brandy. He rose from behind a dark oak desk and extended a hand that was cold and perfectly dry. I shook it, resisting the urge to check if he had a pulse. "Mr. Goodwin, is it? From—" "I freelance," I said, "mostly scouting for stories that still have teeth. I heard Thomas Lane was working on something before he died. Thought it might be worth tracking down." That did it. A flicker behind the eyes. Quick, well hidden, but there. "I'd heard about Tom," he said carefully. "Tragic, a sharp mind, terrible vices. Such as truth," he said dryly, "and poor timing." He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. "I take it you're not here on behalf of the New Yorker." "Only if they've switched to trench coats and insomnia. No, I'm just curious. Lane was digging into something big, wasn't he?" Calton studied me for a beat too long. "Let me be blunt, Mr. Goodwin. Writers die every day. It is not always the story that kills them," I smiled. "But sometimes it is, right?" He didn't answer. "Look," I said, leaning forward, "I'm not trying to make trouble, just trying to understand what Lane was working on. Do you know if he ever brought you a manuscript? Something sensitive?" "No," Calton said smoothly. "He spoke of an idea once, half-baked paranoid. Something about corruption in a corporate advisory firm. But he never named names and he never showed me a page. Did he mention meeting with anyone about it? I believe he was trying to contact someone he referred to as the architect. Whatever that meant." "Catchy," I said. "Did he leave anything with you?" "Nothing physical, though he asked an odd question the last time we spoke." "Oh?" "He wanted to know what would happen if someone published a story posthumously. Without naming sources, without confirmation, just implication. And what did you tell him?" "I told him editors aren't priests, we don't absolve, we amplify." I whistled low. "And then he drops dead the next night. Makes a man wonder." Calton smiled, thin and humourless. "Wonder is fine. Accusation is tiresome," I rose. "I may come back with more questions." "Please don't," he said with practised civility. Outside, the wind had picked up. I lit a cigarette and leaned against the stone stoop, going over what I'd learned. Or rather, what I hadn't. Calton knew more than he was letting on, but Wolfe had taught me the difference between guilt and knowledge. One sweats, the other edits. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe already in the office, feeding orchid roots like they were made of sin. I gave him the rundown, ending with Calton's cryptic comment about the architect. He nodded. That's the second time. We've heard a title with no job description. First, someone powerful. Now, an architect. Could be a nickname, I offered, or code, or just poetic nonsense. No, Wolfe said, setting the sprayer aside. It is deliberate. It denotes design, structure, someone who creates, but hides behind their creation. He looked at me sharply. Archie, I want you to locate Claire Lane, Thomas Lane's sister. We must see if the blood relative knows what the typewriter refused to tell. You got it. And Archie? Yeah? Take care. This is no longer about fiction. It never was. He turned back to his orchids, but I could tell the game had deepened. The typewriter was silent, but the plot was just starting to speak. Chapter 6. The Sister in the Photograph Finding. Claire Lane wasn't as straightforward as flipping through the city directory and circling her name in red ink. She hadn't left a forwarding address, and the super hadn't been generous with clues. But Wolfe had taught me a thing or two about digging people out of the shadows. I started at the Vantage offices, where Thomas Lane had last worked, and followed a chain of reluctant editors, overworked secretaries, and one very talkative janitor until a name surfaced. A small teaching college in Queens. Claire Lane, adjunct, lecturer in modern literature, had been working there part-time under the radar. I called, posed as a publisher. It wasn't entirely a lie. And got an appointment. She agreed to meet me at a cafe near the campus called the Sparrow's Cup. She was already there when I arrived. Same face as the photograph, just older, drawn tighter by grief and the city's usual wear and tear. She wore a navy coat that she swallowed her frame, and her hands were wrapped around a mug of black coffee, like it was the only warm thing in her life. Miss Lane, I said, sliding into the seat across from her. You must be Mr. Goodwin, she replied. Her voice was soft but unshaken. The assistant. Archie, I said. I work with Nero Wolfe. You've heard of him. My brother talked about him once. Said he could smell guilt in a room. Accurate, I said. I'm sorry for your loss. She nodded but didn't say thank you. We're looking into your brother's death, I continued. We think it wasn't a heart attack. Or if it was, someone gave it a helping hand. Her eyes flicked up sharply. You believe he was murdered? I believe someone had a strong reason to want him silent. Your brother was working on something. Dangerous. He left behind a manuscript. Incomplete. One page was missing. I know. That stopped me. You do? I saw it, she said. 2 nights before he died. He brought it to my apartment. Said he needed a place to think, to write in peace. He stayed the night. What was on the last page? She hesitated. He never let me read it. Said it was safer that way. But I saw the title. He called it The Keystone. Said it was the linchpin in a network of fraud. Finance, politics, media, all tied together. Did he say who was involved? No. But he was scared. I hadn't seen him like that since we were kids. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I was to find a man named Calton. Oliver Calton, she nodded. He said Calton had helped him once before, years ago. Something about an anonymous leak, I think. He trusted him, or he used to. He may have regretted that, I said. Claire looked down at her coffee, silent for a moment. Then, I think Tom knew he wouldn't finish the story. He told me something that night. He said, even if they take the last word, the silence will still point to them. Cryptic. Wolfe would love that. Do you still have anything he left behind? Notes, drafts, anything? She reached into her bag and handed me a manila envelope. This was in his suitcase. I haven't looked at it. I took it and tucked it into my coat. We'll handle it carefully. As I stood, she placed her hand over mine. Find out who did this, please. I nodded. That's the plan. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded. When I dropped the envelope on his desk, he didn't move. She had it the whole time, I said. A folder from his overnight bag. Wolfe opened his eyes and reached for it. What's in there? I asked. He didn't answer. He simply removed the papers, glanced at the top sheet, and narrowed his eyes. He turned to the second page, then the third. His fingers stilled. Well? I prompted. There's a name here, he said. One that was buried in the prose. He refers to them as a builder of false empires. A man called Wadley Mason. I froze. Adley Mason, the financial consultant. The same, Wolfe said grimly. He sits on the board of 3 corporations Thomas Lane mentions by name, all of them implicated in minor scandals, none of them proven, and he's never been touched. Because, Wolfe said, he builds the facades. Others walk through the doors. I took a breath. So we're looking at a man who constructs cover-ups, not just companies. Wolfe nodded. And if Lane named him in the final page, then that page is worth killing for. Outside, the city pulsed on, but inside, the walls of the brownstone seemed to tighten, as if the silence itself had started to close in around us. Chapter 7. The Man Behind the Facade. W. Adley Mason was nervous. He didn't show it. That was the first thing I noticed as I stepped into the penthouse office on Madison Avenue. The place was a cathedral of clean lines and expensive silences. All glass, teak and chrome, with a view of the city that could make a senator feel poor. A secretary with eyes like winter ice told me he'd see me briefly, which was corporate code for until he finds out you're not buying anything. Mason himself was perched behind a wide desk that looked like it was carved from a single block of mahogany. Mid-50s, tall, white-haired, and sculpted in that Ivy League way that makes you wonder what kind of blood pact someone signed to get a face that confident. He wore a navy suit that cost more than my car, and had a voice so smooth you could butter toast with it. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, standing to shake my hand, "what can I do for you?" "I represent a client with an interest in certain documents that may have crossed your path. Indirectly. Specifically, materials once belonging to the late Thomas Lane." He blinked, just once, then smiled. "Ah, the writer." "Among other things, I read the obituary. A shame. Talented fellow, pity about the heart. Some people think it wasn't just his heart that gave out," I said evenly. He tilted his head. "Do you?" I think Lane was writing something that made a few important people sweat. I think some of them might have liked it better if he never reached a final sentence. A pause. Not long enough to be guilty, but long enough to signal calculation. "Writers exaggerate," he said. "It's what they do. They turn shadows into shapes, sure. But sometimes the shadows are cast by real people. Lane mentioned you by name. Now he did react. A small twitch near the corner of his mouth, like a lawyer's smirk turning sour. He did he? Mason said, voice dipped in disdain. In the draft we found, I said, called you a builder of false empires, which, I'll admit, has a nice literary ring to it. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, an unconscious imitation of Wolfe that almost made me laugh. Mr. Goodwin, he said slowly, I've advised hundreds of businesses. I've spoken at Harvard. I chair philanthropic boards. If a journalist, especially a struggling one, chooses to dress me in villain's clothing for his private novel, that is hardly a crime. Unless someone kills to make sure that story doesn't see print. His smile froze. I let it hang in the air for a beat. Then, did you ever meet with Lane? No, he said. Did you ever want to? His answer came too fast. No. I stood. I'm going to need a list of your recent business associates, preferably the ones who don't appear in your speeches. He rose, still composed. You'll need a subpoena. That's Wolfe's department, I said, stepping toward the door. Mine is just asking the questions you don't want to. Here. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the sidewalk, Wolfe's words were echoing in my head. He builds the facades. Others walk through the doors, and Mason, he was a man who'd built enough facades to house 1,000 lies. At the brownstone, I found Wolfe brooding over the manuscript again, his eyes tracking the typewritten lines like they were enemy movements. He didn't look up as I reported on the meeting, word for word. When I was done, he simply nodded. He's lying, Wolfe said. No question. But about what? Not about knowing Lane, Wolfe said. About fearing him, which is worse. Gestured toward the typewriter pages. This work, this unfinished thing, it isn't merely an accusation. It's bait. I frowned. You think Lane wanted someone to come after him? I think, Wolfe said quietly, he knew someone already was. A silence settled between us. Not heavy, but sharp. A silence that meant the game had changed. Outside, a cold rain began to fall, tapping against the brownstone windows like a warning. Inside, the typewriter's silence grew louder, and somewhere out there, the last page of Lane's story was still missing. Chapter 8, An Echo in Carbon Copy. The next morning, Wolfe refused his eggs. That, if you don't know the man, is the detective equivalent of a 5-alarm fire. Fritz had prepared them perfectly. Soft scrambled with a trace of truffle oil. And Wolfe barely glanced at the plate. He was seated in his usual throne at the dining table, but his eyes were locked on the carbon copy of Lane's manuscript I'd had made overnight. Wolfe never liked handling originals unless necessary, and the carbon let him reread without damaging the integrity of the evidence. You'll note, he said as I sipped my coffee, the use of repetition in Lane's prose. Certain phrases return unchanged across different anecdotes. Writer's habit, I offered. He probably thought it sounded poetic. No, intentional. He tapped a page with one thick finger. This paragraph on page 16 mentions a glass tower of silent teeth. The same phrase appears again on page 23, right before the story cuts off. And Lane's mind was sharp. If he was scared, his repetition wasn't. Lazy. It was coded. I leaned over to scan the page. "So, what's it mean?" "That," Wolfe said, "is what you'll find out." He finally pushed the eggs aside. "Go to Lane's apartment again. Search for anything referencing teeth, glass towers, anything that matches the phrasing. Look for a pattern, Archie. This manuscript is more than a narrative. It's a map." 10 minutes later, I was back in a cab headed to the apartment on West 78th, armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and Wolfe's disdain for loose metaphors. When I reached the top floor, the door still bore the police seal, now curling at the edges. I slipped in, careful not to leave anything disturbed, and headed to the desk. Wolfe was right about Lane. He didn't write like someone crafting fiction. He wrote like someone hiding something in plain sight. The phrase "glass tower of silent teeth" kept rolling around in my head as I checked his bookcases, the closet, even the water tank in the toilet. Nothing. But when I pulled out the bottom drawer of his desk again and gave it a sharper rap with my knuckles, the sound changed. Hollow. I fished out my penknife and pried at the floor of the drawer. After a few minutes, the panel popped loose, revealing a thin envelope taped beneath. Bingo! Inside were several yellowing note cards, handwritten in a rushed scrawl. Most were references, names of obscure articles, 3-letter acronyms, initials and dates. But one card stood out. It read "Glass Tower, Finchu, WAM Silent Teeth, Mark Media Front if found. Page 24 is in the Hive." I stared at it for a minute. The Hive sounded like a club or a storage locker, maybe even a nickname. But if it held the missing page, we were closer than we'd ever been. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant room, tending to a row of exotic orchids with a gentleness he rarely afforded humans. I filled him in. He didn't even flinch. "The Hive," he murmured. "It's a co-working space." "A what?" "A shared office suite in Midtown. Journalists, freelancers, designers. Lane once mentioned it in passing. I presumed it was figurative. Well, either way, it's concrete now." Wolfe finally turned to face me. "Then we must retrieve the page before someone else does, and we must assume someone else is already looking." "Want me to take backup?" "Yes, but not from the police." He paused. "Take Saul Panzer, quietly." That meant Wolfe was rattled. I made the call. Saul didn't ask questions. He never did. By dusk, we were standing outside the Hive on East 45th, watching the steady stream of 20-somethings and over-caffeinated writers file in and out like ants with laptops. Saul glanced up at the sign. "What exactly are we looking for?" "A page," I said, "one that someone might have killed for." We went in. The Hive buzzed, and not in a metaphorical way. The place actually hummed with fluorescent light and the white noise of dozens of shared ambitions. Saul split off, heading for the back offices while I made for the front reception. I flashed the name Thomas Lane. No one recognized it. Then I remembered aliases. Back upstairs, Lane's note cards had also listed one strange pseudonym scrawled. In the margin, M. Marrow. "Do you have any files under the name Marrow?" I asked the receptionist. She checked. "Yes. Storage locker 7C, assigned 6 months ago." I smiled. "Perfect. Can you let me in?" She hesitated. "Only the owner, or someone with written authorization." I handed her one of Wolfe's pre-signed legal documents. He'd never left home, but he prepared. 5 minutes later, I had the key to 7C. Inside the small locker was a battered briefcase and a stack of notebooks. Nestled on top, as casually as if it were just another essay draft, was the final page. Page 24, typed, dated, signed Thomas Lane. I didn't read it. Not yet. Instead, I locked everything back up, slipped the page into my coat, and turned to leave. Just in time to see someone watching me from the end of the hall. A man in a grey coat, tall, thin, too familiar. I stepped forward. He turned and disappeared around the corner. By the time I reached the street, he was gone. But now I knew we weren't the only ones tracing Lane's trail. The silence of the Black Typewriter was starting to shout. Chapter 9. The words that shouldn't exist when I returned to the brownstone. The lights in Wolfe's office were already on, and the room was steeped in that warm amber glow that made even bad news feel intellectual. Wolfe was in his chair. Of course, that's where he lives. And he didn't ask whether I'd found the page. He could tell I had, probably from the way I held my coat like it was made of glass. "Let me see it," he said. I removed the page from the inner lining of my jacket and placed it on his desk. He picked it up with the delicacy of a museum curator and began to read. His lips didn't move, but his eyes did, scanning slowly, methodically. When he reached the bottom, he exhaled, not like a man relieved, but like a man who'd expected something awful and got worse. "Well?" I asked. Wolfe looked at me with something close to pity. "This is not a conclusion," he said. "It is a declaration." He handed the page to me, and I read it for the first time. They build the towers and plant the seeds. They speak through headlines, control the tide, and silence the architects. But one keystone is removed, and it all collapses. You, W. Adley Mason, stand at the centre. You don't hide behind empires. You are the empire. T. Lane. I let out a low whistle. He named him, point blank. Yes, Wolfe said, and not just named, indicted. This page was never meant for the story. It was meant for safekeeping. A failsafe, which means someone knew it existed, and someone else wanted it gone. Wolfe nodded once, and now they'll know it's been found. He stood. Wolfe stood. I'd seen it fewer times than a lunar eclipse. "We must move quickly," he said. "We must make noise. You want to rattle the cage? I want to throw the cage into the river and see who dives in after it." He dictated a letter, addressed to W. Adley Mason. In it, Wolfe simply stated that he had obtained page 24 of Thomas Lane's final manuscript and would be holding a private reading of its contents in his office the next day at noon. Mason was invited, as were a few others. I blinked. "You're summoning suspects like it's a séance." "Better," Wolfe said. "It's theatre. And Mason is accustomed to controlling the script. Let's see how he handles improvisation." By morning the trap was set. We sent the letter to Mason via courier, another copy to Oliver Calton, and a third to Claire Lane, who Wolfe insisted be present. "It will be important," he'd said cryptically, "that someone in the room still believes in her brother." At precisely 11:57, the brownstone doorbell rang. I answered it. Mason entered first, flanked by a tight-lipped assistant who didn't remove his sunglasses indoors. Mason himself was unreadable. No panic, no sweat, Just that smooth armor of untouchable wealth. "I assume this is legal?" he asked. I smiled. "You're not on trial, Mr. Mason?" "Not yet," Wolfe said from behind his desk. Next came Calton, his mouth tight as a wine cork. He offered no handshake, just nodded and took the seat I pointed to. Claire arrived last, pale but composed, a file clutched to her chest. Wolfe waited until the clock hit 12, then he began. "In the interest of clarity," he said, "I will read aloud the final page of Thomas Lane's manuscript, the page that vanished before his death, a page that none of you until now could be certain still existed." He read it slowly, deliberately. His voice filled the office like thunder waiting to strike. When he finished, there was silence, then Mason spoke. "This is libel." "No," Wolfe replied. "This is a dead man's warning, one we intend to heed." Claire looked at Mason. "You had him killed, didn't you?" Mason smiled, a tight professional smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Of course not." Wolfe folded his hands. "Then you won't mind if I forward this to the press." That broke the mask. Just a crack, a tightening in Mason's jaw. "Careful, Mr. Wolfe. Allegations like that can have consequences." "Yes," Wolfe said. "Especially when they're true." But Wolfe didn't press the accusation, not yet. Instead, he turned to Calton. "You withheld this page," Wolfe said. "You were afraid." Calton's eyes flicked toward Mason. "I didn't have the page. I only suspected what was in it." "And you didn't warn Lane?" "I tried. He wouldn't listen." Wolfe glanced at Claire. "And you? You held the suitcase. You had the key." "I didn't know what I had," she whispered. "Then you're the only innocent person in the room," Wolfe said. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching them all sweat beneath Wolfe's gaze. Tim hadn't solved it yet, not entirely. But the final page had started a fire, and tomorrow someone was going to burn. Chapter 10. The Orchid That Didn't Bloom. After the page reading, the room didn't explode. It contracted. The walls of Wolfe's office seemed to draw in closer, and even the air felt dense, like we were all trapped under the same unspoken pressure. Mason had retreated to a corner of the room, his assistant still wearing those sunglasses, like we were in a noir film instead of a brownstone. Calton sat stiffly, as if moving might shatter the last of his spine. Claire Lane, her files still clutched to her chest, watched Wolfe with a quiet kind of defiance. Wolfe, for his part, hadn't moved since finishing the reading. He sat like a mountain, watching, waiting. He didn't need to say anything. It was my job, so I said, stepping forward. "We're in a bit of a pickle, huh?" Nobody laughed. That was all right. I wasn't aiming for humour, just breaking the ice before someone decided to smash it. "Mason," I continued, "you didn't come here to refute anything. You came to see if we really had the page. Now you know. So what's next? Another anonymous scare letter? Another heart attack?" "I came here," Mason said evenly, "to witness a farce. But I'll admit, it's a well-rehearsed one." Claire turned to Wolfe. "You said you believed my brother knew someone would come for him, that he left this page behind intentionally." "Did," Wolfe said. Lane was not just writing to expose, he was writing to trap. The moment he used Mason's name in a private document, he guaranteed a reaction. I raised an eyebrow. A reaction that cost him his life. Not yet proven, Mason replied quickly. But conveniently timed, I added. Wolfe shifted. Mr. Mason, you are a man of exceptional resources. You possess, I am sure, the means to monitor individuals you consider a threat. Your business depends on foresight, surveillance, silence. Mason didn't respond. Wolfe continued. Thomas Lane was not your first problem, nor your first cover-up. But he may be your last. He left behind more than one page. That landed. Claire blinked. What? Wolfe opened the drawer of his desk and removed a second envelope. Lane left a second letter, handwritten. It was in the envelope his sister gave us. It contains the same accusation, but it names another figure. You handed it to me. I unfolded it, and there it was, brief, scrawled in ink. If anything happens to me, tell Saul to find the name Denton Rills. He's the one who pulled the plug. Mason hides. Denton acts. Mason exhaled, sharp and involuntary. Gotcha. Whose? Denton Rills? Claire asked. I turned to Wolfe. He nodded once. A fixer, I said. A very quiet one. Not listed in any company books. But Wolfe's been tracking his movements since Lane died. Mason's mouth twitched. You paid him, didn't you? Wolfe asked. To scare Lane, perhaps more. Silence. Wolfe didn't press. He didn't need to. He simply let the moment linger. And then came the knock at the front door. I opened it to reveal Saul Panzer and Inspector Kramer. Sorry to crash your gathering, Kramer said, brushing past me, eyes darting around, the room like a wolf in a henhouse. But we've got something. He pulled out a folder and handed it to Wolfe. Wolfe skimmed, then nodded. To summarize, Wolfe said, addressing the room, Mr. Rills was spotted entering Lane's apartment building the night of his death, wearing gloves, leaving without them, and wiping the banister on the way out. We now have a warrant out for him. The evidence points towards staged natural death, an overdose masked as a coronary event. Mason stood. I had nothing to do with that. Kramer grunted. Save it for the deposition. Wolfe turned to Claire. Your brother wasn't paranoid. He was precise. He used the only weapon he had, the written word, and trusted it would outlast him. Claire blinked rapidly, holding back something I wasn't qualified to name. Calton stood, looking older than he had when he walked in. What happens to the manuscript? Wolfe looked at Claire. That decision belongs to his sister. She didn't hesitate. We publish it, all of it, with the missing page and the letter. Mason didn't speak. He just left, quiet and fast, his assistant trailing like a shadow that had overstayed its welcome. After everyone had cleared out, I turned to Wolfe. He looked exhausted, in his own immovable way, and didn't reach for his beer or call for Fritz. What now? I asked. He leaned back. Now I tend to the orchids. Of course, I left him to it. Outside, New York had returned to its usual rhythm. Taxis honking, steam curling up from manholes, and a world mostly oblivious to the fact that one man, with a typewriter, had nearly toppled an empire. The silence was broken, and sometimes that's all it takes. Chapter 11. A Matter of Principle. 2 days later, Inspector Kramer returned, not with a scowl and a cigar, but with a small nod and a manila envelope under his arm. For Kramer, that was practically a handshake and a bouquet. Fritz showed him in without announcement, which meant Wolfe had either anticipated him or forgiven the intrusion in advance. I was already in the office, feet up, going over transcripts from the morning's press calls. Claire Lane's decision to publish her brother's manuscript had turned the literary and financial worlds upside down. Calton House had announced a special release under its non-fiction imprint, and the buzz was loud enough to wake people who didn't even know who Thomas Lane was. Kramer dropped into the red chair like it owed him rent. "You were right," he said. Again, Wolfe, who had just returned from his orchids, sat behind his desk and folded his hands as if he'd never left the room. "We've picked up Denton Rills, got him in a safe house in New Rochelle. He cracked after 3 hours. Said he was hired to warn Lane, but Lane didn't scare easy. Said Mason told him to make the problem evaporate quietly." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. So the Empire was not only hollow, it was desperate. Kramer passed the envelope across the desk. "Deposition. Clean as it gets. Details on the injection used, the timing, everything." Wolfe accepted it without comment. "He'll take a plea," Kramer added. "Mason's another story. That man's got more lawyers than you've got orchids." "Not quite," Wolfe said mildly, "but close." Still," Kramer grunted, "between Rills's statement, Lane's page, and the financial records Archie dug up, tying Mason to 3 dummy firms, it'll stick, eventually." I smiled. Justice by paper cut. Kramer stood. "You did good, Wolfe, even if it kills me to say it." He turned and left before Wolfe could say anything back. Probably intentional. After the door closed, Wolfe remained still, eyes unfocused. Not meditative, just deeply reflective. The case was over. But for him, the real prize had never been the confession or even the moral victory. It was the architecture of truth, the way lies were layered, and how, with enough patience, the structure always revealed its flaw. I leaned forward. "You think it'll hold in court?" "No," Wolfe said flatly. "But the public will convict him long before a jury does." He gestured toward the pile of newspaper clippings on the corner of his desk. Headlines ranging from "Empire of Silence Exposed" to "Lane's Last Page Leaves Legacy of Justice." "You never really liked journalists," I said. And yet one has done more good in death than 10 politicians alive," Wolfe replied. "Even I can acknowledge irony when it blooms." There was a long pause between us. Then Wolfe said quietly, "You know, I once told Lane, years ago, that his writing was too idealistic, that it would never change anything. You said that? I did. He disagreed. He said, it only needs to change one thing, whether or not they sleep easy at night." He looked up. It appears he succeeded. We sat in silence for a while after that. Later that evening, I stepped outside for air. The city hummed like it always did, pretending it hadn't come inches from choking on its own secrets. I lit a cigarette, turned up my collar, and watched a pair of pigeons squabble on a telephone wire. In the window above, Wolfe was already back with his orchids, his only indulgence besides justice. Somewhere out there, a man in a glass tower was wondering who else might have a typewriter. And that, I figured, was victory enough. Chapter 12. The Silence. That spoke the morning after the indictment, the brownstone returned to its usual rhythms, which is to say, nothing happened that wasn't scheduled. Fritz was back in command of the kitchen. The orchids were being misted on Wolfe's precise rotation, and I had the distinct pleasure of updating our case files while pretending the world wasn't still buzzing from the Lane story. But there was one thing left, one final piece of the puzzle that hadn't settled into place, and Wolfe knew it too. It was why he'd asked Claire Lane to return, just once more. She arrived just after 11, dressed in the same navy coat, a thin leather-bound journal tucked beneath her arm. I brought her into the office, where Wolfe waited behind his desk, hands folded, eyes on the open window and the orchids that swayed gently in the breeze. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice low but certain. "You gave my brother back his name." "No," Wolfe replied. "He never lost it. He merely entrusted it to time." She smiled, sad and grateful all at once. "I've read the full manuscript," she said, "and his letter. It's strange, reading the final thoughts of someone you love, packaged like a warning. There's a reason he gave it to you," Wolfe said. "He understood the burden of truth requires faith to carry it." She set the journal down on the desk. This was his. I thought maybe it belonged in the file. Wolfe opened it. Inside, in Lane's angular handwriting, were scattered notes, doodles, a list of coffee brands he hated, and in the centre, underlined 3 times. "Don't worry about the ones who hate you. Worry about the ones who call you brilliant. And want to own your silence." Wolfe read it aloud, then closed the journal gently. After Claire left, Wolfe didn't speak for a while. He simply sat, the journal on the desk before him, one finger resting lightly on the cover. Then, as if rising from thought, he turned to me. "Archie, do you know why this case matters?" I gave him my best deadpan. "Because it kept you from dealing with those tax forms?" He actually smiled faintly. "No," he said, "because for once the victory was not in the punishment. It was in the proof. The truth, documented, preserved, undeniable. Even if the law fails, the record does not." I leaned back in the red chair. "You think the public will care a month from now?" "Some won't, most won't, but some will remember. And one will write something else, inspired by Lane. And perhaps one more voice will speak when someone tries to silence the next." That was Wolfe's version of optimism, grim, precise, and utterly unsentimental. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the office long after Wolfe retired upstairs. The city buzzed outside, taxis, distant jazz, the occasional dog reminding its owner who really ran the block. On Wolfe's desk, the typewritten page still lay unfolded, page 24. I picked it up and read the last line again. "You don't hide behind empires. You are the empire." And then, just beneath it, something I hadn't noticed before, scrawled in ink, barely visible in the margin, "Let them come." If I've done this right, they'll be too late. I smiled. He was right. They were. And somewhere, in the silence of a typewriter that would never click again, justice had already found its voice.